So welcome to the University of San Francisco. My name is Ludwig Chincarini. I'm a professor here. This is the Silk Lecture featuring Nobel Laureates. This is different than the other Silk series. It's a Nobel Laureate series that Jeff helped build. The purpose of the series is to allow students, faculty, and staff and members of the USF community to get access to these great thinkers and to interact with these great thinkers. The structure tonight shall be a 45-minute lecture with then a 30-minute Q&A. We have lots of questions, so please be patient. You can always leave, but I would stay around to hear the really exciting questions. I would also like to thank the CFA members for coming tonight and the CFA for working with us to offer these events to their members, and in particular, thank you, Ann O'Brien. We also thank the students that helped organize this event, especially Marcus Krieger, David, Divya, and Andrea, the staff of USF like Jazz Johnson, Sam Bethel, Will McKay, Susan Owens, and Stephanie Dixon for making things work well. Most importantly, though, I would like to thank Jeff Silk, Naomi Silk, and the Silk family. They have continued to contribute and make the University of San Francisco a better place, and in general, the world a better place through education. We also thank President of USF, Father Paul, for supporting these great efforts. Please give a hand for the Silk family. Please give a hand for the University of San Francisco and making the world a better place. And then if you could turn off your cell phones so they don't make that strange interruption. Our guest speaker is a giant in theoretical economics. A large part of his work deals with how asymmetric information can cause market failure. For those who aren't familiar with this jargon term, asymmetric information is when one party has more information than the other party during a transaction. He has been a prolific writer in economics for the past 50 years. He's written on a variety of topics, including unemployment in the labor market, macroeconomics, industrial organization, the theory of taxation, public economics, and natural resource economics. He has served the United States as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Clinton from 1995 to 1997, and chief economist of the World Bank from 1997 to 2000. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001, along with Michael Spence and George Akerlof. He obtained his BA from Amherst College and his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Joe Stiglitz is currently the Institute Professor of Columbia University. Before we start, I'd like to tell you two quick stories. One story is for the students here tonight, and it's about hard work, working hard, and not taking anything for granted. When Joe was a grad student, he used to sleep in his office because it saved more time. He didn't have to commute, and he could focus on work. He worked hard. The other thing a lot of people don't know about Joe Stiglitz, he didn't have very much money in grad school. He really worked hard, and Joe will tell you the exact details, but I think he lived on roughly $5 a day. Okay? So he worked very hard. So that's the lesson to students. Now, the other story is my personal story that I want to share. When I helped build a revolutionary startup, investment startup, we worked with Joe. Joe was our chief scientist. And every week or so, Joe and I would meet with the CEO to discuss new innovative products to help make investing better for everyone. We worked on some amazing products, some of which still don't exist today. And if they did exist, they would help a lot of people. Okay? So hopefully one day they will exist. In fact, just so you know, we were one of the first brokerages to ever offer free trading. Okay, this was a long time ago. Funny enough, Joe won the Nobel Prize while he was working with us as chief scientist. And he came to the firm, I think the next day, to talk to all the employees. And that was really, really exciting. Personally, that was the most productive and exciting time in my life. And I remember the most exciting part of my week was to sit on the curb with Joe waiting for the taxi cab to pick him up. And we would chat about all kinds of things, and he would tell me why I was wrong about so many things. So thank you, Joe. Today, Joe is still working on how to improve people's lives. Today, he will discuss his new book entitled People, Power, Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. How many people have the book? Can you stick it up? A lot of people. Joe, we might get to the bestseller. Could you please give a warm welcome for Dr. Joseph Stiglitz?
Well, it's a real pleasure to be at the University of San Francisco again. And the subject of my talk is really, I think, a very important one, which is how do we change our economic system? And what I'm going to try to argue is that this idea of progressive capitalism is at least one of the ways that we can go about changing our economic system. It hasn't been working in many different ways. We have a climate crisis, we have an inequality crisis. A few years ago, we had a financial crisis. And I'll give you some statistics to show the ways, one aspect, which is the inequality crisis, and I'll try to explain why the current form of capitalism hasn't worked. Progressivism is the belief that progress is possible and it's within our power to construct an economic and social system that advances progress. And as an economist, I'm going to talk mostly about sustainable increases in standards of living, including life expectancies and including living within our planetary boundaries. But I also want to emphasize that social justice is not just a matter of economics. It is about creating a more humane society with less prejudice, discrimination, and exploitation. And that will be a sub-theme in some of what I'm going to be talking about. So this just is a reminder of the fact that for centuries before the late 18th century, before the late 1700s, living standards did not change hardly at all. There was really stagnation. And suddenly then around late part of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, they started to increase very dramatically. And this chart, it's really, I don't want to put too much emphasis on this data. It's very hard to get data like this, but a parallel set of numbers, which looks very similar, is that real wages of London craftsmen. In the UK, they love to collect data, and so they have lots of data on the wages people get paid and the prices of goods, and they calculate for hundreds of years these wages. And if you look at it, again, you'll see almost nothing happening. If you look at it very carefully, you'll see that wages did go up during the bubonic plague. So if you wipe out a third of the population, what economists say is true. You reduce the supply of labor, the wage does go up. But it's a pretty dramatic thing you have to do is wipe out about a third of the population. But again, you get this picture around 1800, real wages start to go up. And another dimension of this is the increase in life expectancy. And again, you see a doubling of life expectancy since 1820. So these are really dramatic changes in every aspect of our standard of living. And the natural question is, what made all this possible? Well, there are basically three things. Advances in our understanding of the world around us, with science, advances in our understanding of humankind, the social sciences, and advances in social organization, the ability to organize cooperative activities, to coordinate on a very large scale. And among that are economic activities through markets governed by the rule of law, collective action, which is necessary for modern economy and society, and in the political realm, a kind of understanding of democracy, setting the rules of the game, with separation of powers, checks and balances, a whole set of institutions that we sometimes take for granted and are now being under attack, but are really fundamental to the way our polity works. And all of these were central ideas of the Enlightenment, and it set the stage for progress that follows. So I'm giving this as a background because what I want to talk about is how are these ideas now being translated into our economy, how they're being challenged in our economy and in our polity today. So here are some of the basic ideas that I want to develop here. The first is the source of the wealth of nations, which is the material manifestation of the progress that I described earlier, is the creativity of its people, including public investments, especially in science and technology. And I want to emphasize the widespread confusion between what makes for the wealth of a nation and for wealthy individuals. Individuals can get wealthy by seizing a larger slice, a larger fraction of the nation's economic pie, but not adding to the nation's economic pie. And these in economics are referred to as rank seekers or exploiters. And I'm going to try to suggest that in the US and some other advanced countries have become, to a very large extent, a country of rank seekers with outcomes that serve mainly a few at the top, leading to poorer overall performance, and with dire consequences for our economy, our society, and our politics. The particular version of the market economy, which is sometimes called neoliberalism, and the US more often referred to as supply-side economics, unfettered capitalism with too much focus on markets, too little focus on collective action, has not worked well. It provided a large scope for this kind of rent-seeking activity that I've just described, and its result of this has been a high level of inequality, and it's particularly inadequate for the 21st century, where there are what economists refer to as massive market failure, externalities of climate change, which are putting our very existence at risk. So even before coming to these, you might say, long-term but very fundamental issues, there has been, in recent years, a justified discontent with our economic system. In spite of the advances in knowledge and about economics and reforms in our economic system, growth in the United States over the last 40 years, the era of neoliberalism or supply-side economics, the era that began, say, around 1980, growth has been 2/3 of what it was in the decades after World War II. And this is particularly surprising since we are supposed to be in an age of innovation. And there are similar problems in other countries, this marked decline as we changed our economic system towards this market fundamentalism, neoliberalism. Moreover, not only has the growth been slower, what growth has occurred has gone mostly to a few at the top. So just as to look at the two numbers that illustrate, and I'll get into numbers a little bit on the inequality a little bit more later. This shows the marked decline in both Europe and the United States after the era of neoliberalism, after the era of unfettered capitalism began. And it's really declined dramatically in both US and Europe. And the next slide shows the extent is one figure that shows the extent of inequality. You'll see in that curve a line that, if you don't look carefully, you might think is the horizontal axis. It's not the horizontal axis. It's the average income of the bottom 90%. We're not talking about the people in poverty. We're talking about the average income of the 90%. Now, if you have really good eyes and look at this through a microscope, you can see some increases in income. But you don't need a microscope to see what's happened to the dotted line at the top. And that dotted line is the average income of the top 1%. So the fortunes of the bottom 90% and the top 1% have really diverged over the last 40 years. And this is true not only in the United States, it's also true in Europe, but to a significantly less extent. So the main thesis of this talk is that progressive capitalism provides an alternative economic model to the unfettered capitalism or the neoliberalism, supply-side economics that has dominated for the last 4 decades. Now, some people will say the words progressive capitalism is an oxymoron. You can't have the two words next to each other. I wrote an article in the New York Times saying, no, progressive capitalism is not an oxymoron. I'll try to explain why I think that's the case. But what I'm going to try to suggest, what do I mean by this progressive capitalism? It's a new social contract between the market, the state, and civil society. I have the word capitalism there because I believe that the market will play a very important role. The economy is too complicated to have anything like central planning, the old kind of top-down. You're going to have decentralization, and in that decentralization, markets, firms are going to play a very important role. But you also, I use the word progressive to remind us that it's not unfettered capitalism. Capitalism is not an end in itself, and too often we think about GDP as an end in itself, the market is an end in itself. But these are means to an end, and the ends are what we have to be thinking about. But the ends are things like a better society and a higher standards of living for all of our citizens. So that's what I'm going to try to argue today. An important part of this idea is to recognize that a successful society must be based on a rich ecology of institutional arrangements. Not just markets, and we sometimes focus, and not just government. The non-for-profit institutions are really important. Churches are important. They're neither market nor state. And if you look at all of our successful educational institutions in the United States are all either foundations, church-related, not-for-profits, or state institutions. Emblematic of the for-profit institutions, I shouldn't say this, I know, is Trump University. But it excelled in one thing, figuring out how to exploit people who wanted to get ahead in life. And it was sued, but and had to settle them for millions of dollars. But it is what a private, unfettered market can result in. And when I was in the Clinton administration, one of the things we tried to do with these for-profit institutions was to regulate them better, And the problem was, and even part of the regulation was just to disclose their graduation rates, to disclose whether the students were getting anything for the money that was being given, and that the government shouldn't be lending money for students to get zero value. And not surprisingly, they pushed back and did so successfully, at great cost to our society. But there are other institutional arrangements like co-ops. The only part of America's financial system that worked, of the banking system, that worked well in the years before the financial crisis, that did not engage in all kinds of predatory lending, were our co-ops, which are called credit unions. And the only part of our banking system that after the crisis that continued to lend to small and medium-sized enterprises were our credit unions. The others really contracted in lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. They forgot their mission, and one of the reasons we had a severe downturn as we had. But there are, in various parts of the world, really successful co-ops. Even in the United States, there are successful co-ops. But one of the most successful cooperatives is Mondragon in Spain, with over 1 million members, and founded by a priest, and very successful in a whole range of economic activities. One of the important points I want to emphasize is that economic relations shape who we are. Cooperatives encourage cooperative behavior and have broad implications for the nature of our society. And the other side is that if you have unbridled capitalism, you shape people to be in the way that they're encouraged to be. And that leads to the kind of moral turpitude that we've seen in so many sectors of the economy. And shouldn't be that much of a surprise. It's not only in the financial sector, in the auto sector, you're having Dieselgate, the pharmaceutical industry engaged in the opioid crisis, pushing drugs that they knew were addictive, the food industry, encouraging young people to use foods that lead to an epidemic of childhood diabetes. So you might say that the moral component of what has happened with capitalism is something that should disturb us and the way it has been shaping who we are. So these are the broad themes that I want to talk about. I won't have time to go through all of them in the limited amount of time, but I'll try to sort of go into a few of them in greater depth. So let me begin again with the source of the wealth of nations. The argument I'm putting here is very different from the most famous book in economics is Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And he was trying to explain what the wealth of nations was. But he was writing before the modern economy. It was the end of the agriculture. It was right, he was part of the Enlightenment. But his example of what was to explain economics was a pin factory. So he was writing before innovation economy, even before manufacturing on a scale was present. And as we reflect what it was the reason that we went up in that very steep trajectory of increases in standard of living, it is the creativity of people, investment in people, in infrastructure and in capital goods, but especially, as I said before, in science and technology, and the institutions that enable them to cooperate to do more than anyone could have done alone. And that means collective action, acting cooperatively. One aspect of this that I do want to emphasize is all of these systems of social organization, science, social science, they're all about they all require systems of assessing what the truth is. What do we mean by the truth? We don't know anything for certain, but there is still what we might call scientific consensus. There is enormous consensus over the fact that global warming exists. Climate change exists. And with that amount of evidence about climate change, to be a climate denier at this point is really absurd. And of course, in New York, in California, you've experienced with the fires, Australia's with the fires. One of the things that I was on the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that looked at back in 1995. And the one mistake we made was that we did not realize how fast things would change and how severe they would be. And there were things that we felt at the time, but we didn't feel like we had a compelling evidence. But now there is, that an important aspect of climate change is an increase in extreme events. And it is the extreme events that are having enormous costs, periods of no rain, very extreme heat, extreme cold. It's not just warming, it's these extremes. Well, the point I'm making is just using that as an illustration that we are in a peculiar moment in our today where there are some people who believe we are in a post-truth world, that we can all have our opinion about whether climate change exists. You can't. You can have your opinion, but it's wrong if you think it doesn't. And that's true about an awful lot of the aspects of our society, what is going on. And in order for society to function, we need to be able to have institutions that help us ascertain the truth. And that's why we have a bureaucracy in government. We have judiciary to try to separate out, weigh claims. These are all, I don't want to claim that there are any of them are perfect, but they play an absolutely essential role in our society. So to me, the most disturbing aspect of our political moment is the attack on our basic epistemological system, with far-reaching effects on our civilization, our standards of living, and the functioning of our systems of political and social organization. And it is, I think, something that we will have to deal with going forward. One of the, a second theme that I raised in the outline I put before was that there's a major confusion between what makes for a country rich and what makes an individual rich. Individuals, as I said, can become wealthy by rank seeking or by wealth grabbing. And there are many ways in which they can exploit, one individual can exploit others. You can exploit market power, asymmetries of information, human foibles and vulnerabilities. You could take advantage of political power. The concern is that a large fraction of wealthy individuals derive much of their wealth from exploitation. And this is true even when there is some social contribution. Wealth can be amplified, inequalities in wealth can be amplified by the exercise of market power. It is worth noting that those who have made the most important societal contributions, for instance, the discovery of DNA or the transistor and laser, are not among the wealthiest people in our society. So when we think about who is at the top, you know, most of those people have made a contribution. That's not the issue, but it's not, the people who've made the biggest contribution are not the wealthiest people in our society. And And this problem is particularly evident in the financial sector, where the share of the sector in our GDP grew from 2.5% to nearly 8%, and actually growth slowed and became more unstable as inequality grew. Well, in the United States, I think in recent years, there's been the particular form of exploitation I want to comment on is the growth in market power. The standard textbooks that you probably use begin discussing a discussion of competitive markets, demand and supply, as if everything is nice in competitive markets. Well, you've wasted your time. That doesn't describe any real economy, and it particularly doesn't describe the American economy. If you look across the American economy, in sector after sector, you have 1, 2, or 3 firms, sometimes 4 firms, or they have a disproportionate share of the sector. And that's not only true in the obvious cases that people have talked about, Facebook, Google, Amazon. It's even true in little things like dog food, drugstores. In New York City, you can see different drugstores, Duane Reade and Walgreens, but they're owned by the same company. They are the same company. They just try to deceive you into think that there's competition. As we look at the data, it shows this enormous increase in concentration. There are a whole variety of reasons for this increased concentration. And I won't have time to go through them. They're listed on the slide. But one of the reasons is that we've rewritten the rules of the game under the influence of those who supported the unfettered markets to weaken our antitrust laws, to weaken our competition laws. So we have not done what we should have been doing to make sure our economy is competitive. And again, for those of you who remember Adam Smith, he had this famous quotation that said that people of business seldom get together, whether for merriment or without conspiring against the public well-being. And this was 240 years ago that he said that. And it's true then, it's true now. You would have thought the big technology giants were, making so much profits that they didn't have to get together to conspire to lower the wages of their workers. But they did. Conspire not to hire the engineers from each other so that the engineers who were the basis of their wealth. And we would never have known about it because these are always done in secret. I mean, it's illegal. So you don't typically find it out, except something somehow it leaks out. And in that case, there was a suit, and they had to pay a significant amount of money as a result. Well, one of the consequences of this market power is the growth of inequality. But of course, there are many other factors contributing to the growth of inequality. And there are also, this inequality is manifested in many ways. Stagnation of income in the middle, decreases at the bottom, the share of labor is decreasing, wealth is even more concentrated than income. There are inequalities in access to health, inequalities in opportunities and voice, power, and access to justice. And I think the numbers are so dramatic that I just want to spend a few minutes going through them very quickly. So this shows what's happened to the median income of a full-time male worker. These are all adjusted for inflation. And a lot of the discontent that you see in certain parts of the United States is concentrated on males. and it may be hormonal, but one of the reasons is that their economic prospects have not been very good. And what this chart shows is that in the median means in the middle, half above, half below, is the same as it was 42 years ago. And you don't feel that in San Francisco, but there are many parts of the country. This is looking at the country as a whole, where this is the reality that they face. At the bottom, things are even worse. Our minimum wage, and people, there are a lot of people not at the minimum wage, but not that far from it. The minimum wage in the United States today is the same as it was 60 years ago. Can you imagine not having a pay raise for 60 years? You'd probably be a little unhappy. And the labor share, figuring out what the labor share is difficult, but if you take out the top 1% of labor, which are not workers, they're people like bankers or CEOs, or, they're called labor because they get a W-2. But they're not laborers in the way you would think about it. That's fallen from 75% to 60% in a relatively short span of time. As I said, wealth is much more inequitably distributed. There's one chart that I shouldn't really pick on a couple of people, but there are two families in the United States who worked hard. They chose, I tell my students there's one important decision you have to make in life, and that is to choose the right pairings. And if you mess up on this, your life prospects are not so good. Well, these are two families that chose the right pairings. So they did it right, and then I'll show you some people who didn't do it right. So they did it right, and so these the Walton family and the Koch brothers, both of who inherited large amounts of money, they have a net worth of 2016, 212 billion. I should update it. And that's the same as the net worth of 150 million Americans. So 8 people is the same as 115. Globally, it's even worse, the inequality in wealth. The share of wealth of the top 1/10 of 1%, the top 1/10 have about 20% of the wealth of the country. Probably the most disturbing statistics have to do with the inequalities of opportunity, because we always think about America as a land of opportunity, American dream. But the fact is that people at the bottom, if you're born there, you're likely to stay there. And if you're born at the top, you're likely to stay there. For those of you born at the top, that's probably good news. But for the rest of you, it's not so good. Looking across countries, what you see is that countries differ in both their inequalities in income and inequalities of mobility, prospects of moving up. And there are some what this chart shows is those countries, like the United States, who have the most inequality of income, have the least equality, at least opportunity. So the United States and the UK have the highest level of inequality and the lowest level of opportunity, and the Scandinavian countries have the lowest level of inequality and the highest level of opportunity. Well, not a surprise that health statistics also say the same thing. The remarkable thing in the United States is, even though we have some of the best medical research in the world, our life expectancy has been going down. And not a surprise, because we're the only advanced country that doesn't recognize the right of access to healthcare as a basic human right. What is particularly disturbing is one of the causes of this remarkable decline in life expectancy is what are called deaths of despair. People who've given up hope. And deaths from suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. And in a way, what is also remarkable is how rapidly things have deteriorated in the country. This is what is called a heat map of the United States. And the darker colors represent the parts of the United States that have lower life expectancy, higher morbidity. And what you see between 2000 and 2015, and things have gotten worse in the last 3 years, what you see is that a significant increase in a significant decrease in life expectancy in certain parts of the country. And interestingly, those are the parts of the country that have the least opportunity as well. If you did a graph with opportunity, it would look the same. The problems may become worse because of changes in technology and with the fact that our growth pattern is not sustainable, particularly we are not living within our planetary environment. So when we look at all of, I'm going to focus on only one of the many sources of inequality, but one that can be shown to be play a particular role, and market power. This growth of market power not only helps explain the growth of inequality, but also helps explain some of the other macroeconomic anomalies, like why is it that the share of profits have increased enormously, but investment has stagnated. So, understanding the role of market power and exploitation in generating inequality supports a new view of inequality. It used to be thought that the only way we could get rid of inequality was in ways that would lead to slower growth. Arthur Okun, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson, wrote a book called The Big Trade-Off. You could have more equality, but only if you were willing to sacrifice growth. And the new view is that the two are complementary. You could have more equality and more growth. They can work together and support each other. And this is not only a view that I put forward in a book called The Price of Inequality, say we're paying a high price for our inequality. It was a view that, it's now a view that the IMF has been arguing. And for those of you who don't know, the IMF is not a left-wing institution. So it has become very much of a mainstream idea. So let me now try to come very quickly to talk about what are some of the key elements of progressive capitalism. So I see progressive capitalism as a major reform in the system that has led to this inequality crisis, to the health crisis, all these problems that I've only been able to hint at. It harks back in the word progressive to earlier period where we had the progressive reforms at the end of the 19th century. That was a period where inequality again had grown and monopoly power had grown. The two grew together at the same time. You had Standard Oil, you had a whole series of sectors of the economy dominated by one firm. And what happened was they passed a whole set of legislation, like our antitrust laws, but a lot of other progressive legislation in the years that followed, including labor legislation, that tamed capitalism, tamed the market economy, and resulted in inequality coming down and our economy growing faster and becoming more competitive. So really what I'm talking about is going back to that kind of mindset, but of course we're in the 21st century, we're not in the 19th century, so there are different reforms. The particularities are going to be different, but it's basically in the same spirit. So there are four major elements of this. Rewriting the basic rules of the economy to constrain power and its abuses, to create a more efficient and fair economy, to ensure that we live within our planetary boundaries. Secondly, progressive public expenditures to do what the private sector cannot or will not do, or to do what the government has a comparative advantage of doing. Thirdly, fair and efficient taxation to help finance public expenditures. And the fourth is ensuring access to a middle-class, decent life, including through what I call the public option. The point of the fourth is that even if we succeed in the first three, the kind of middle-class life that we've thought of 40 years ago is not going to be accessible. The basic necessities of education, housing, may not be accessible to significant fractions, and we are going to have to do something about it if we want to create a humane society. So in the few minutes I have remaining, what I want to do is describe these four elements very briefly. The first is rewriting the rules of the market economy. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured. Societies can't function without good rules. It's part of the rule of law. Now there's, in recent years, there's been a very large campaign against regulations. As if regulations per se were bad. The Ten Commandments were a set of regulations about how people can live together. Our cities, New York, San Francisco, if we didn't have stoplights, we would be in perpetual gridlock. And stoplights are a regulation. They're a simple rule that says you can go first, and then it's a way of taking turns and telling them whose turn it is. It's a simple regulation. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't, in fact, if you don't have a regulation, you will be paralyzed. The cost of not having a regulation is enormous. And of course, we have to understand that rules have large distributive consequences, and a lot of the fights over the rules are not about having rules or not having rules, it's which rules, and whether the rules will favor one group or another. And that's why the rules are such a contentious subject. Well, many of the current rules were written in the era of neoliberalism or supply-side economics in ways that led to more inequality, more market power, and in the end, a less efficient and a slower growing economy. They ignored the need for and the importance of collective action. Market can't address the problems of externalities. They require some kind of collective action. And of course, climate change is obviously the most important externality that we have to face today. They also had a particularly narrow view of the market economy, and this is actually one of the areas where there's been a dramatic change, even in the last year. 40 years ago, one of the things that Milton Friedman, who was the high priest of this supply-side neoliberalism in the United States, he argued that firms, corporations, have one duty and one duty alone, and that is to maximize shareholder value. And he basically said it was a sin if the manager did anything other than that. If he didn't screw the workers as much as he could, if he didn't take advantage of his customers or his suppliers, that he wasn't maximizing shareholder value, and that was his social obligation in our society. And he was very persuasive, and he succeeded in getting many laws changed throughout the United States, not in other countries, not in Germany, not in a lot of other countries, but in the United States, and embedding this philosophy into the law. Now, I had already written in 1977 an article with Sandy Grossman explaining why that was wrong, showing that maximizing shareholder value did not maximize societal well-being. But, I was young, and I wrote it in mathematics. He wrote it in prose. And it shows you prose wins over mathematics sometimes. But I was right. And so the interesting thing is that last summer, the Business Roundtable, which is all the largest corporations, almost all the CEOs of the Business Roundtable said, we have to change away from shareholder maximization to a broader view of stakeholder capitalism, where you represent, shareholders are important, but so are workers, so are customers, so are the communities in which firms operate, and so is the planet. And they have an obligation to care for all of those. And it was interesting, I was in Davos a couple of weeks ago where, all the muckety-mucks get together once a year. And it was really interesting the extent to which, especially the European business people, but also the Americans, were taking on board this change in perspective. Well, so the point I want to just emphasize is that we are at a time where we have to rewrite these rules. And as we look through it, virtually every rule has to be rewritten in order to address the myriad of problems, the crises that we face. I want to spend just a minute talking about one set of rules, and that is about the rules that will enable us to live within our planetary boundaries. We need prices to guide the economy, but prices alone won't suffice. They have to be complemented by regulations. And these regulations don't have to be complicated. It's just no coal-fired electric generating. That's not a complicated regulation, not hard to enforce. You just don't allow it. And there are other regulations that are equally simple to implement. We also need public investments. Public investments like public transportation, or simple to make sure that you can have electric cars and they can be charged everywhere. So these are just little public investments that will help deal with what I believe is a very urgent problem, and something of a broad scope, of a kind associated with a New Deal or a World War. And I think it can provide an opportunity to change our social and economic structure in a way that our social and economic structure was altered by World War II. And it resolves what I view as a fundamental quandary. There's a lot of discussion going on these days about a worry about unemployment. Will AI, robotization lead to high levels of unemployment? Ben Bernanke, the chair of our Federal Reserve at the time of the crisis, also talked about a savings glut. We have too much savings. And when he said it, I wondered what planet he was living on. There's this view that you have too much labor and too much capital. But there's the other view you hear that we can't afford to do anything about climate change. What does that mean, we can't afford it? We don't have enough resources. But how can it be that we have too many resources on the one hand and we don't have enough resources on the other? Obviously, these are intellectually incoherent views. And I think a rapid transition towards a green economy is the best way of ensuring the full utilization of our resources and that it can be financed. Well, I've been told I'm run out of time, so I'm going to say just a few things about the next set of topics. Progressive expenditures, I began by talking about the importance of science for the advance of our standard of living, increasing in life expectancy. Well, underlying all science is basic research. And basic research is almost all financed by government. It's part of our collective action, what we do together. And I don't know if you've been following the recent budgets that have come out. Massive cuts in science. And one aspect of science, just to relate it to something of current affairs, there's a concern about a virus in China. Among the kinds of things that in the previous budgets of this administration were massive cuts in the Center for Disease Control, exposing us to greater risk. And actually, a particular thing that was cut was science research on transmission of diseases from animals to humans. The particular thing which is at risk now. So you could not have targeted something worse than what was happened in the previous budget cuts. And I hope we don't have to pay a price for that kind of reckless undermining of our basic science fabric. A second thing that I've emphasized is the growth of inequality in parts of the country where things have not gone very well. That's partly a result of deindustrialization. And that's a kind of structural transformation, and markets don't handle those structural transformations on their own. Some countries have faced up to this fact and have helped those parts of their countries that are going through a structural transformation without, and the results have been far better than we have, where we've just let those areas suffer. So that's part of a progressive expenditure program. Progressive taxation, the United States is one of the few countries where we have regressive taxation. Regressive means the people at the top pay a smaller percentage of their income than those at the bottom when you look at the whole tax system. Obviously, if we just taxed fairly those capital at the same rate that workers who work for their living, we would have trillions of dollars over a 10-year period. Warren Buffett rightly put it that there's something wrong in a society where he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. So there are lots of other ways that we can raise more revenue without impeding our growth. Economists talk about rents taxing rents as being non-distortionary. and taxing monopoly profits is non-distortionary. In fact, it discourages monopolization. But also, taxing bad things like pollution will raise large amounts of money and at the same time create a better economy. And the final point I want to raise is, as I said before, doing all this will help our economy grow faster, but it won't suffice to ensure the middle class life for most citizens. And what is needed is a 21st century reinvigorated welfare state. So let me just conclude by saying a new course is needed. The old economic model has failed for over 4 decades. In the first few years when it failed, you could say we haven't given the experiment enough time. There's a famous story of Zhou Enlai being asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it was too soon to tell. But I think that we can say that this neoliberal experiment has failed. 40 years is a large fraction of the history of modern capitalism. You know, it's only been going for some 200 years, so we're talking about 20%. So we've had a 20-year experiment for 40 years, and it has failed. Lowering taxes at the top and deregulation did not lead to faster growth, only to more inequality, more instability, more exploitation. And mild changes are not likely to make matters much better. So what we need, I think, today is major changes based on what we have learned from successes and failures here and elsewhere. And the bottom line is what I call social progressive capitalism. You can call it other things. In Europe, they tend to call it social democracy or reinvigorating social democracy. It requires a new economic order based on a new relationship between the market, the state, and civil society. And I believe that this can produce greater growth with more equality and address the climate and inequality crises that we are today confronting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And to everyone here, sorry that we've gone over, but hopefully you're excited. And we have a lot of good questions, so we're going to try to get through all of them. So let's start right away, Joe, and to the extent we can keep it a little bit brief, let's do that.
Okay.
Okay, so first question is, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned over your lifetime about economics?
Well, I think, let me go back maybe to say what motivated me to do the research that I did, and it may be relevant to some students, was the theories that I was taught, I came to believe were wrong. And the standard model said the market was efficient, you can separate out inequality, you didn't have to worry about inequality. Those ideas were very powerful in economics. Adam Smith's invisible hand, that the pursuit of self-interest would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of everybody in society. Those ideas were very powerful. I had grown up in Gary, Indiana, which is a steel town, that was marked by massive racial discrimination, high inequality, labor strife, episodic unemployment. And as I grew up, it was so apparent that those economic theories didn't describe my experiences. And so I guess my answer is one has to look at the world as it is and ask whether our models comport to the way the way the world is.
Okay, thanks. Another question. You talked a lot about the economic system not being right, capitalism, progressive capitalism. Could it also just be that, you show the growth numbers, growth has dropped. Could it just be we're not as creative as we used to be, that there's some limitations to growth, and we're at that point?
Anything is possible. The irony is that we think of ourselves as an innovation economy, and yet growth is slower. And so it's natural to ask, what is going on? Now, there is a strand of thought. Bob Gordon, who was a classmate of mine, is a leading proponent, that says that we discovered all the big ideas early on, like electricity and indoor toilets. and those were really things that were big. They changed life expectancy. I mean, and that, yeah, there are not, that cell phones are nice, but they don't have the impact that these other more fundamental things have. But I think it's actually, if you look, just to give you another piece of data, what's been happening in the last 10 years, 15 years in the United States is that the number of new firms has been in decline. The number of young firms headed by young people has been in decline. So that there is a barrier, seems to be a barrier to entry, and particularly strong in the United States compared to some other countries. And that change is consistent with the interpretation of more market power, more concentration, barriers to entry.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I'm skipping a little bit here and there so I can also get to audience questions. This is a tough question. Are you ready for this, Joe?
Yeah.
So there are several well-regarded economists who disagree with your prescriptions for more government involvement. William Easterly and Ken Rogoff said the following. In his focus on market failure, Joe often misses the bigger problem, the need to roll back the disastrous distortions of markets by government. And Ken Rogoff said, we do not believe that markets are always perfect, but we do believe that government failure is far bigger problem than market failure. So how can we reconcile these views?
Well, so first, anybody who lived through, again, I shouldn't be saying this, but anybody who lived through the Bush and Trump administration know that there are government failures. So that, I agree that you cannot ignore government failures. My answer is, first, if you look at in sheer magnitude of losses, the losses associated with the financial crisis, if you add up all those losses, they're in the trillions of dollars. No government outside of war has ever wasted money on the scale of that's associated with that financial crisis, which was, I believe, a very much private sector. And the reason we would not have had the crisis if we had had better regulation. And what we had in the almost half century after the Great Depression, where we did pass strong financial regulation, there were not any crises. And then I think people made the mistake. They said, well, we don't have any crises, so why have regulation? And of course, the reason we didn't have crises is because we had the regulation. So they took away the regulation, and guess what? Very quickly, we started having crises. So I think that government is imperfect. That's clear. All human institutions. You know, I always say other people are fallible, but all human institutions are fallible. And what we need to strive to do, and that's, is create an ecology of institutions where you have checks and balances, where we don't have concentrations of power, and that we need an active civil society to check both government and markets. And what we need is to strengthen these. And you know, as just one example, I think part of the checks and balances of both the private and the public sector are in active media. And one of the very disturbing things currently is the denigration of the media and the important role that they play in our society.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We're going to get to some fun questions soon, but here's a question. We mentioned government, and so you've presumably advised different governments over time. So the question is there a government that didn't listen to your advice? If so, what government and what happened?
I don't know if there's any government who has listened to my advice. Well, first of all, I think to a very large extent, when governments ask your advice, they know what you're going to say. And they're asking your advice because they want you to reinforce what they're going to do anyway. So you shouldn't think that when you see the government following your advice, that it's because it's your advice. A very good example of that was the Japanese government had proposed raising their sales tax because they had a deficit, and I had told them, so I had said their economy recovery was not strong, and they should not raise their sales tax. Well, eventually, Abe became worried that he was going to cause a recession by raising the tax. So he asked me to come over there and advise him not to raise the tax. So he knew what I was going to say. I said what he knew I was going to say. And then he said, "Oh, we've been advised not to raise the tax." And he didn't. He postponed raising the tax.
Okay, thank you.
But the last time I was there in August, and the economy was doing better, and he was about to raise the tax. And so I saw him, and before I could even open my mouth, he says, "I'm not going to have a carbon tax." Because I had been arguing telling him for a very long time, not only him, but everywhere, you ought to incentivize people not to pollute, not to emit carbon. And I've been telling him, look, if you had a carbon tax, it would stimulate your economy because people would have to retrofit, they would have to make more investments to make the green transition, so it would stimulate your economy, and you would get tax revenue. And so I've been, having this campaign for a carbon tax. And so he knew by that point, if he asked my advice, what I would say. So before I got a chance to tell him, he said, "I'm not going to do it."
Okay, thanks for that story. Here's some light stories, and then we're going back to audience questions that you mailed in. How did your life change after winning the Nobel Prize, and what is the coolest thing that happened because of it?
I don't think it changed actually a lot. For a lot of people, it does, because they're the kinds of more people know about asymmetric information now than they did before, but they don't want me to lecture about it. Asymmetric information. I mean, it will put a lot of people to sleep if I do. But a lot of what I talked about tonight was the kinds of abuses that occur. Exploitation would not occur if there were a lot of if there weren't asymmetric information. So I guess the thing that it's given me more of an entree into talking to lots of governments and understanding the political process better, and seeing lots of economies. I guess that's probably been the most interesting. You get people to read some of your work that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Okay, thank you. Who was a mentor of yours, and can you describe the greatest lessons he or she taught you, and what are the greatest lessons that you have passed on to your students?
Well, I was really lucky at that particular period when I was studying at MIT. It was an amazing institution. It was just a particular moment, particular people. An interesting story that one of the reasons that Paul Samuelson went to MIT, he was the most brilliant student at Harvard, was because of anti-Semitism at Harvard. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to believe, but it was very strong, going back that long, it was very strong. But we had, as our teacher, my committee was Paul Samuelson and Bob Solow, both of whom not only got Nobel Prizes, but I shouldn't say this, but again, we distinguish between different kinds of Nobel Prizes, people who shouldn't have gotten it, people who unambiguously should have gotten it, and then there's the people in between where you could have a discussion. Well, Samuelson and Solow and another one of my teachers, Franco Modigliani, were all people that were, and Ken Arrow, were four of the people that were at the very, unquestionable, some of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. So I was very lucky with my teachers. I guess what I said before at the beginning of this conversation is what I tell my students. Don't just take somebody else's model and tweak it. You shouldn't be focusing on publications, mm-hmm. Which has become part of the what goes on in academia today. And you can get a publication by taking a model, somebody else's work, and then showing it's not quite true, or it's a minor, what is sometimes called normal science, a step forward, mm-hmm. not a big step forward, but so I don't want to denigrate it, but I try to encourage them to be a little bit more risk-taking, okay, and a little bit bolder.
Okay, that's great, but you never told me what you were taught by these mentors of yours. So you mentioned the mentors, but what lesson did Solow give you, or Samuelson?
Oh, they had so many. Samuelson had lots of statements. He one of them I remember. I'll tell you too. One of them was, "You only make a first impression once." The point was, what he said is very important the first time you meet somebody to put your best foot forward, because that will affect their view of you. And another one was a variant of Benjamin Franklin's idea: early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. The way he put it was, there are two kinds of economists. Those who work in the morning, early, and those who work late at night. And he said the latter burn out very early in life, and the other one continues to work for life. So his view was, if you want to have a sustained career, go to bed early and get up early.
Okay, great. That's...
I don't know, but it's what I've
It worked for
done.
you.
It worked for me.
It worked for you.
It worked for me.
Is there anything you learned from a family member that has helped you in your life or your career?
Well, I think, obviously both my mother and my father had a lot of influence. One of the things, when I was very young, what should I do for my career? What should I do? And they were very simple and straightforward. They said, money will never make you happy. Don't think about money.
That's what, my mom said the same thing. I just want to add that.
Yeah. Secondly, what will make you happy are two things: being of service to others, and using your mind. God has given you a good mind. Make sure you use it to the full. So those are three things, and I've always kept them in mind.
That's great. Okay, guys, I know, just be patient because we've got Joe Stiglitz. Out of all your accomplishments, what are you most proud of and why?
That's a really hard, I can't answer that. Let me tell you a few things, and I don't like the word proud, but let me, so obviously, my academic work, I would say helping revolutionize economics is something I'm proud of. But there are a couple of other things that also were, I think, very important. Let me give you two other examples. One of the things I did with Nick Stern, Lord Stern, we were both, he succeeded me as chief economist of the World Bank. And about 15 years ago, the president of premier of Ethiopia came to us and said he needed more resources to be able to convert his economy to a greener economy, to make green investments. He just didn't have the money. And could we figure out a way of getting more money to him? So we thought about it, and we came up with an idea that the BRICS, these are 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, had at that moment as much wealth as the Western Europe, the US had at the end of World War II, when they founded the World Bank. So we said, why don't we get these BRICS these countries to start a green bank to lend money to poorer countries, to themselves, but also to poorer countries, to finance a green transition. And so it was a very different kind of task, but it was sort of shuttle diplomacy, getting these 5 countries, very different. Imagine, China and India haven't always been in a love fest with each other. And getting these 5 countries to agree to create a bank, which was called the BRICS Bank or the New Development Bank, which is now lending billions of dollars a year for the green transition. So I think, in terms of making, you might say, a concrete change, that was a big deal. And another case that another thing that I think I am very proud of is one of the problems in our economy is intellectual property. That the intellectual property regime sometimes restricts access to life-saving medicines. And that means people die unnecessarily. And I've been waging a campaign to change the intellectual property framework. And maybe, I can't remember, but must have been about 10 years ago, not quite that, I got approached. This is one of those occasions where, partly because of getting the Nobel Prize, I'd been at a conference and I got to meet the head of the ACLU, and we started talking about ideas. And the ACLU There was a company that had the patent on two genes, which are the BRAC genes, which if you have those genes, the probability of getting breast cancer is very high. It's like 70%. And of course, if you want to know that because you can take actions to sort of monitor and preventive actions. Okay. So, but this company, Utah company, was charging like $5,000 for the test. It was an inferior test. And they wouldn't let anybody else give the test because they said they had the patent. So there were researchers at Yale that developed a better test and wanted to give it out free, or got other people to, and they said, no, it's our patent. And we went to the court and said, that shouldn't be. I mean, they had better arguments than that. The lawyers had better arguments. But so I was part of that in trying to say, what was the economic argument against this extreme version of intellectual property? Why it was better for our society to change the patent law. Okay, and that was against the Constitution. And we eventually, after a lot of work, we prevailed, and now women can get this the better test, and the price is gone way down, and innovation has increased in this whole area as a result of the Supreme Court decision.
Thank you, Joe. So we just have a few more. I'm cutting out a lot of these questions. These are audience questions, and then we have one recommendation to students. One audience question: why do you think socialism appears so appealing to today's youth, in spite of history showing it never works and the average person is worse off, e.g. Cuba, Soviet Union, Venezuela? This was from a faculty member.
Okay, so words, like socialism mean different things. The idea of the meaning that it had 100 years ago or even 50 years ago was government ownership of the means of production. No one is talking about the government ownership of the basic means of production. No one is talking about government running steel mills, government running, the basic. So and Cuba is caught in that past, and Venezuela is caught in that past. But today, the discussion in Europe and the United States is not about that kind of change in Europe or in America. So to confound that kind of socialism of 100 years ago with what people are talking about, what Sanders calls democratic socialism, or in Europe they call social democracy, is really is a disservice to language, and is really just an attempt, a smear campaign in my mind.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And I want to finish. Why is it that so many people, people ask, a lot of the young people, why are you supporting Bernie Sanders and his democratic socialism? And one of the answers is, if you say we're going to have access to education, so we don't graduate with 30, 50,000, 100,000 of debt. Every other country manages to have some way of getting an opportunity without this debt. In the United States now, student debt is $1.5 trillion, and is growing. Access to health care. If it's socialist to have access to health care, well, France has better outcomes, higher life expectancy by a lot than the United States, and spends half the amount the United States does. Is it socialist? I don't know, but they give better health care, and more humane health care too. So you go down each of the things that people care about. Should you have a secure retirement? Yeah, you should. If you worked hard, what level is a question we can debate. But should you be preyed on by people trying to take advantage of you? I think the answer is no. So what they're really saying is there ought to be ways, and this is what a lot of the when I talk about progressive capitalism. You could call it democratic socialism. I prefer the word progressive capitalism because I emphasize the word market. And markets are going to be an important part of it. But Bernie Sanders believes in markets. Elizabeth Warren believes in markets. In fact, one of the things she says is, we're trying to make markets work like markets are supposed to be. Transparent, competitive. That's markets. It's irony that the people who are working the hardest to make markets work are people who are being labeled socialist. They're actually trying to make markets work.
Thank you, Joe. I'm gonna go right to our final question because we have some really good audience questions, more of them, but I think people are getting anxious here. So here's our last question that we always ask, which is, what 3 pieces of advice would you give to students at the University of San Francisco to be successful in either the business career or their life career, or both?
Besides what I've already said, I mean, I guess, what do you mean? First of all, what does it mean to be successful? I think what you mean by successful, it shouldn't be about money. It's about being of service. It's about using your brain, using your human capabilities, which can be compassion or whatever your strengths are. So I think you need a balanced view of what is success. And that's the same for an economy. That's why I've argued that GDP is not a good measure of a successful economy. It has to be broader than that, and how things are shared, and broader concepts of standards of living, security, and things like that. So I think it's trying to get a balance, and I guess I would say a balance in every respect, balance between family, community, and their job. And I would say if they go in running a company, make sure that they worry a little bit, not just about their shareholders and their own CEO pay, but also about their customers, their workers, the community in which they live, and the planet that we live on.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe.